Okay, welcome all and good morning. We are so happy to have you here for the first part of our language justice training, engaging linguistically diverse communities. Community Language Cooperative would like to start by doing a language justice statement, so I will turn it over to Indira.
Hello, everyone. My name is Indira Guzman. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yes. Okay. Hello, my name is Indira Guzman, and I'm here with the Community Language Co-op. This morning, the organizers of this event have made a commitment to language justice. What that means is that we want everyone to engage and participate in the language of their heart. So for this, we're going to utilize simultaneous interpretation. In a second, we're going to go ahead and turn on interpretation, and you will see a little icon that looks like a world icon on the bottom of the screen. Click on that and select the language that you prefer to engage in. So if you don't speak Spanish, make sure that you select English on that so that you could hear the interpretation in English. Parts of this presentation will be presented in Spanish, and we want to make sure that everyone understands what's being said. So I'm going to repeat this in Español for our Spanish-speaking friends, and then we'll get started. Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Indira Guzmán. Esta mañana los organizadores de este evento han hecho un compromiso a la justicia del lenguaje. Entonces, para esto vamos a utilizar la interpretación simultánea. En un segundo vamos a aprender la interpretación y usted va a ver un icono terráqueo en la parte posterior de su pantalla. Asegúrese de hacer clic ahí y seleccionar español si quiere escuchar esta presentación en español. Esta presentación va a ser bilingüe, entonces partes van a ser en inglés y partes en español. Asegúrese de seleccionar el idioma en el que prefiere participar. So we are going to turn on interpretation right now, and I'll do a quick sound check, and you could give me a thumbs up if you could hear me. Thumbs up if you could hear me in English. In Inglés, I'm speaking English right now, not Spanish. So if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. I'm going to go into the Spanish channel.
All right, Maria, I think we're good to go, and we'll just give periodic reminders for folks that are coming in. Make sure you select a language on the bottom of your screen. If you just came in and didn't get the instructions on interpretation, make sure you select your language. Asegúrense de seleccionar su idioma en el globo terráqueo abajito.
Make sure you select your language in the bottom icon. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you both. So for this first session, as you were just introduced to Indira, we have two co-facilitators and one interpreter here, all from Community Language Cooperative. So I wanted to give a brief background and introduction on each of them before we get started today. Indira Guzman is a co-founder and director at the Community Language Cooperative, and she'll be our interpreter today. After her Chicano Studies degree at Metro State University, Indira has acted as a liaison for the Spanish-speaking community throughout Denver. Indira lives with her two children in Sheridan, Colorado, where she is a fierce advocate for equitable education. Indira currently sits as a board member for the Sanctuary Christian Fellowship in Commune, Denver, and is part of the leadership team with Sheridan Rising Together for Equity. Indira enjoys spending time with her children and traveling for enjoyment. She is dedicated to building local capacity using the language justice model to build vibrant and effective multilingual spaces to foster open communication across languages and cultures. And next, I will introduce our co-facilitators. The first is Rosa Guzman Snyder. She is co-founder and principal consultant at Community Language Cooperative. She is passionate about community-led initiatives, practicing solidarity, and activating partnerships. Rosa has direct experience in program development, community outreach, curriculum development, delivery, facilitation, and training. Rosa's background includes ample experience fostering both community engagement and social justice. She previously worked with the NCFL as the Community Development Director, where she initiated and developed community support at NCFL's major project sites across the country. Rosa serves as a board member for MORE, a national nonprofit working to close the wealth gap by increasing access to home ownership and entrepreneurial opportunities in BIPOC communities. Rosa holds a Master of Public Administration from the University of Texas at Arlington and a Bachelor of Arts in Spanish and Nonprofit Administration from Colorado State University, Pueblo. And our second co-facilitator is Elizabeth Lara. She is the lead language justice practitioner at Community Language Cooperative. Elizabeth is a first-generation college graduate with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Humanities and Communication, HCOM, from California State University, Monterey Bay. Her education in the interdisciplinary field of HCOM cultivated her multicultural awareness, fostered her critical thinking abilities, and ignited her commitment to social justice. Elizabeth navigates the world with curiosity and a desire for adventure. Her wanderlust spirit prompted her to study abroad in Sweden as an undergraduate student. This experience strengthened her passion for language and cultural exchange, and in time inspired a journey to Spain, where she honed her Spanish skills and taught English. Through her academic, professional, and personal endeavors, Elizabeth seeks to celebrate the world's cultural and linguistic diversity. She finds delight in a warm cup of coffee and fulfillment in creating new memories for her bucket list. So it's such an honor to have all three of them here today to help with this training. I will now turn it over to the three of them.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I want to just remind everyone real quickly, if you came in after the language justice statement, you'll see a little globe icon on the bottom of your screen. Make sure you select the language that you'll be listening in today, whether that be English or Spanish. Parts of the training will intentionally facilitate in Spanish. So I'm going to actually move over to Spanish right now. So make sure that you can listen into interpretation. Voy a hablar en español. Todos me
I am going
escuchan.
to speak in Spanish. Can you hear me in English? Yes?
Okay, perfecto.
Okay, perfect.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosa Guzman Snyder, like Maria said, and this morning, Elizabeth, Indira, and I are here today, very happy to share with you a little bit about language justice and why is it something that we're so passionate about? Why is it something that is so important for us? So, quickly, I am going to pass it over to, I'm going to go over the agenda. This training is divided into two parts. The first part is today, and the next part is next week. So we'll meet again next week. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see it? Yes? Perfect. This morning, Elizabeth is going to talk a little bit about our community agreements. What do we need so that the space can be efficient and a learning space for everyone? And then we're going to be talking a little bit about this idea about our heart language. What is the heart language, the language of our heart? And why is it important for us to be able to connect to that language? We're also going to talk a little bit about the history of language oppression and how does this relate to our actual systems? Why is it important to know what happened to our history? And we need to recognize that the work that we are doing around equity is not something that's happening now, but this is something that we are trying to dismantle a system, like something that's wrong with our system, something that has damaged our communities of color for a long time. So we're going to talk a little bit about why do we talk about language justice and what is the case that we are going to present about language justice. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what are the cases that we're going to do to learn language justice. I want to make sure that everyone is understanding English. Can everyone understand or hear the interpretation in English? Through interpretation, yes? Okay, perfect. So now we are going to continue. I am going to pass it on to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Rosa. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this first part of the two-part webinar. I will only be joining you for this first half, so I'm very excited to be here with you today and to see what engaging conversations we have. Because we're going to be together for 2 hours today, and you all will be back next week for another 2 hours, we want to ensure that we set the groundwork for what this space will look like, and how we will engage in conversations and how we will interact with each other. So we want to set group agreements. And these group agreements are collective. They're not Elizabeth's agreements or Rosa's agreements. So it's everybody who's here today. We would like to hear from you, your input on what you would like to see in this space. So we can get started with that as we either say them out loud or write them in the chat. Rosa will jot them down and then we'll review them all together. So to start us off, I will say that here at the CLC, we like to use the popular education model from Paulo Freire. He was a Brazilian educator and philosopher, and he believed that everybody had something to bring to the table, that it wasn't necessarily the professor or the teacher's job to just dump out all this information and for the students to be like empty buckets receiving this, but rather that everybody had lived experiences that they can bring to the table and that everybody else can benefit and learn from that. So this first one that I want to include in our group agreements is the popular education model. And I'm really hoping to hear from everybody. So please, if you have an idea for a group agreement, go ahead and open up your mic and let us know. You can also write it down on the chat if you're feeling a little shy today. Great. I see Kathy wrote, being kind and respectful of feedback within the group. Yes, kindness and respect. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Assuming positive intent.
Thank you, Karen. Positive intent. Assuming positive intent. How do you think we can make the most out of our time together? There's maybe a couple more. So I'll see another one here is, I think that being vulnerable is something that I'd like to bring to the table in one of the activities that we'll be doing after this. I'm going to open myself up to you all, even though I don't know you. I'm going to be in a very vulnerable space to share part of my story. So being okay with being vulnerable. I see another one here from Karen, being open to new or unfamiliar information. Thank you, Karen. Katie, I see, I'm so sorry to hear you're not feeling well. She says, I'm battling a terrible sore throat. So I'll write here as well, being open to shared knowledge and accepting that with an open heart. I love that, the concept of having an open heart, because if I'm going to be vulnerable, I appreciate that the people receiving it are going to have an open heart as well. Okay. And maybe we can add one more thing here is to take care of yourself. We are going to be covering quite difficult topics, heavy topics. And so if you need to take a moment to step back, maybe take a breath of fresh air or a sip of water. If there's something that's too triggering, then be respectful to yourself, to your mind, body, and heart, and take care of yourself. If you have to take a step back, then do so. And when you are ready, then come back with us. Okay, so Rosa, I'm not sure if you captured those. Let's see if we can see them on our screen.
I did. Give me one quick second.
All right.
Try to write them and translate them at the same time.
Yes.
Here we go.
Thank you so much. Wow. Okay. So just to review, we have here practice popular education, being kind and respectful of feedback within the group, assume positive intent, practice vulnerability, being open to new or unfamiliar information, being open to shared knowledge and accepting that with an open heart, and take care of yourself. Okay, so maybe let's get some reactions, get some emojis going if you are in agreement with these community agreements. Give me a thumbs up or a heart. I see a heart here. Okay, sounds good. I hope I don't get any thumbs down. But if you do feel that way, then you can also let us know. All right, I see a lot of thumbs up. Thank you so much. Okay, so having this established, let's move forward to the first part, which is connecting to our heart language. Indira, in her language justice statement, referenced the language of the heart. And maybe this is a new concept for some of us. So let's kind of review what we mean by that, by heart language. The heart language is when you can be your authentic self, when you are speaking from a place that you don't have to hide any part of you, that you don't have to make yourself small in order to fit somewhere, where you can just step into a place, your whole self, your whole heart, and the way that you communicate with the world, that's your heart language. So you are unique and nobody else is like you, right? And so your heart language will be different from another person's heart language. And when we talk about language, we might think like English, Spanish, Arabic. And yes, we are referring to that as well, but we are also referring to other nuances of the language and how we express ourselves. The way that we communicate has a lot to do with the way that we perceive the world, with our upbringing, even with our personality. So all of this together, all of that is what makes the heart language. So in order to dig in to our own heart language this morning, we are going to do an activity. And this is an activity based on the poem, I Am From. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this poem, but basically you have the phrase, I am from, and then you fill in the blanks. And Rosa, if we can go to the next slide first. I'll explain first what this poem is about, and then I'll share with you a poem that I wrote, and then we'll do an activity. So this poem, what we really want to do is to understand the importance of language and how it's unique to us as individuals, but also how it connects us to everybody else, how we can be individuals inside a collective. So in this poem, we are going to include words or phrases in your heart language. This can be parent or caregivers' names or significant others, special foods, family-specific games or activities, nostalgic songs, stories or novels, phrases that were repeated often, ordinary household items, special places, family traditions, religious symbols or experiences, accidents or traumatic losses, joys, and location of memories, pictures, or mementos. So the reason I wanted to explain this poem first is because my poem is in my heart language, which is Spanglish. So I have phrases that are in English, phrases that are in Spanish. And so I want you to have an understanding first of what types of things I'm including in my poem. So I will read you my poem, and then we're going to do an activity as a collective to write a poem for this group together. Okay, so bear with me. I am from. Soy mexicana americana.
I am Mexican American. I represent two flags.
Immigrant parents forging a path to new horizons through labor and love. I am from speaking English at school and Spanish at home. Porque en esta casa.
Because in this house, you will speak Spanish.
I am from tears of frustration, flipping through a brick-sized Webster's dictionary for hours. No one to help me get my homework done. I am from weekend mornings, woken up by cumbias blasting on the radio, hearing the dreaded, levántate ya que vamos a
Wake
limpiar.
up now, it's time to
And from
clean.
joyful weekend evenings, eating pan dulce and hot chocolate while watching Nickelodeon and Disney on TV. I am from road trips from California to Mexico in December, car sick for 3 days, but a month of running around Abuelito's farm with my cousins, and Abuelita's tortillas straight from the comal to my mouth. What a bliss. I am from bailes y banda en el rancho, los tambores que aún resuenan en mi corazón.
The drums that still hit my heart.
Eating tamales and pozole on Christmas, y recalentado for weeks to come. I am from returning to the US after those visits, feeling lost in my identity. No soy ni de aquí.
I am
ni
not
de
from
allá.
here, and I am not from there.
I am from the journey I've taken to realize. Soy de aquí.
I am
y
from
soy
here,
de allá.
and I am from
I
there.
don't have to be one. I am both. I belong. I am from the Mexican culture that my ancestors passed on to me. Mi idioma natal.
My
Comida,
mother tongue,
y mi piel
food,
blanca.
music, and my
I am also
cinnamon
from the
colored
American
skin.
nationality that my parents saw for me. Learning English, adopting new traditions, traveling, and being the first in my family to earn a degree. I am from two cultures, two languages, two worlds colliding. I never fit inside just one. De todo esto soy yo.
I am from all of this.
Is where I'm from. So as I read this, I'm like flooded with emotions and memories that are both joyful and heartbreaking, and how I've grown up in between two different countries because of my parents' culture that they passed on to me and the American culture that I learned from living here. And all of this makes who I am, and it affects the way that I express myself and how I speak and how I communicate. So that's what we're kind of trying to get to. This is our heart language. I'm not just English and I'm not just Spanish. I'm this combination and this mixture of both. And that's my heart language. So I want to hear from all of you. I want to see what kind of heart languages we have in this space. So let's take a moment. Maybe you've already been thinking as I've been reading and explaining something that you want to share with the group that you're open with. And we'll go back to this page where we can see some examples. And we're going to jot down, I am from, pick one of these to express yourself to the group and to us. who you are and what your heart language is. And when you are ready, we are going to write it in the chat. And when everybody has had an opportunity to write something, we're going to read it together. And that's going to be our I am from poem as a collective. So go ahead and think about it and write it in the chat when you are ready. And thank you so much, Katie and Josh, for your comments. And you can make it as simple or as profound as you want. We just want to get a little piece of you represented in this poem. Thank you, Rosa, for getting us going in the chat. Ali, I see you. You're gonna have to let me know. I've never heard of, I can't even say this word.
Pierogies.
Pierogies.
Yeah.
Yes, good job.
What is this?
They are a oh, how do I want to describe it? They're like a mashed potato stuffed dumpling. They're a Polish dish.
Oh, I'm looking it up now.
You can buy them at the grocery store. There's a brand called Mrs. T's, and they're pretty good.
Oh, okay. I love that. I love exploring cultures and countries through food. A better way when you can't travel.
Agreed.
All right. So let's keep them coming so that we can move along to our next conversation. If y'all just want to wrap up your thoughts, write something down. Okay, I see another one coming in, Katie. All right, let's set another minute and then we'll read what we have. I'm already getting chills reading some of these. So if you are comfortable, I would really like to hear your voice in what you wrote. I think that I could read it if you're not comfortable, but I want to fully give you the space to show us your heart language and where you are from in your own voice. So what we're going to do is we're going to start reading them off from the top, and we are going to start with, if you go to the chat, we're going to start with Rosa, followed by Ali and Katie, and so on. So if you just want to open up your mic, say your piece, close the mic, and then the next person says their part. And this will be our collective poem. If you are not comfortable reading it out loud, send me a quick chat and I'll read yours. Okay, so we're going to get started with Rosa.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, I am from two worlds divided by a wired fence. I am from tamales, enchiladas, and menudo on Saturday mornings.
I am from pierogies and stuffed cabbage, from que sera sera, repeated by my mother.
I am from sand dunes and big water, sand in my toes, in my bed, in my carpet, growing up on boats, rocked by the steady waves of Lake Michigan. I am from the woods, the quiet, the tucked away from city life. I am from two separate households, so very different. I am from my own desire to learn about different cultures of the world, driving around the country and learning the back roads of a new space, becoming a new me every day.
I am from Nashville, lover of fried chicken and casseroles, waterfall hikes, y'all means all, family, food, friends, music, and Southern hospitality.
Erin, would you like to read yours or would you like me to read it? We'll allow her a moment. Maybe it's tech issues. Maybe we'll go with Josh and come back to that one.
I am from a generation that lost our native language.
I am from visits on the poor South Side with my Mexican family and trying to impress my North Side friends with hand-me-down clothes.
I am from the ocean and from the mountains with Italian meatballs on Sunday.
I am from Greek traditions that always seemed strange to me, but somehow made me feel special.
From Goodnight Moon and Compline before bed, sisters singing in the back seat, and enchiladas at Christmas.
Erin, would you like to read yours? Okay, on behalf of Karen, I am the baby and the matriarch. I am to keep the family together and protect the rights of others. I am loyal to my home and to where my family has its origin. Joy is only felt following the difficulty of struggle. So thank you so much, everyone, for being vulnerable and opening up to sharing your heart language with us. So this, as a collective, shows us how we all have unique experiences in our lives, but somehow we still connect to each other. If we're not from the same background or the same country, there are sometimes things that can still link us together, right? So that's the power of language, and language should be used to connect us, to enrich our lives by knowing other people and knowing from other experience rather than to divide us. So we wanted to start here before things get heavy. Let's try to remember and come back to these feelings of more lightheartedness sometimes, or of this feeling of unity as we continue on. Now I'll pass it over to Rosa, and we'll move on to our next topic.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Want to make sure that folks are can listen in through interpretation. There are going to be times that I'll be speaking in Spanish. So make sure that you select English if you need to listen in, if you need interpretation into English. All right, folks, we are going to jump into talking about language oppression and the history of language oppression and how it relates to our work every day. Oftentimes, folks that are talking about how they engage linguistically diverse communities, they think it's just like a one-time thing of, oh, we just failed to provide interpretation, or oh man, we just don't have funding to do this. When in reality, these types of practices are really stemmed in a system of white supremacy and feelings that our country has around people that speak different languages. And so this is why it's so important for us to talk about this and talk about language oppression, because if we know what the root of it is, we can work towards dismantling that. So for us to kind of get started and thinking about language oppression, I want us to watch this video. There is a trigger warning. There's some heavy language, racism, language oppression in this video. But I want you to think about the reality of what immigrants and refugees and folks that speak different languages face every day in communities.
Mais je sais pas quoi dire.
امروز روز خیلی خوب بود.
Я родилась в Баку, откуда мы? Vamos a ir con mi mamá a comer.
Speak English.
Oh.
Speak English, you're in America. Go back to wherever the fuck you come from, lady.
What's your response to people that say speak English?
It's scary.
I just don't understand it. Horrible.
Just racist.
I speak 3 languages: English, Mandarin, and Cantonese.
Speak English.
Okay.
Mind your own business.
It's difficult. It's scary.
You're in America. I speak English.
It's insulting. You don't say that.
Speak English.
No thanks.
I'm a medical interpreter, so I help a lot of Spanish people. And just the other day, this man came up and he's like, "You guys are in America, you need to be speaking English." I actually wanted just to say to him, "Está celoso," saying he's jealous that he's unable to speak another language.
I pay for their welfare. I pay for their ability to be here. The least they can do.
Shut the fuck up. Oh my God. This is America, so we can speak whatever we want.
Speak English.
I'll speak what I want.
Speak English.
¿Por qué? I was at Walmart shopping and I was on the phone with my sister, so I'm like full speaking Spanish, right? This guy turned around and he's like, "You need to speak American. You guys are in America, you need to be speaking English."
You guys shouldn't speak Persian here because like it's rude.
Quiero decirles
Speak
que...
English.
¿Por qué? ¿Por qué tengo que hablar en inglés? ¿Porque tú quieres?
Because this is America.
No. Me sabe a mierda.
We speak American here.
¿Qué es América? América está de nativos, indios, de todo el mundo.
Shut up! You're a fucking piece of shit, you fucking
And explain what I did to you one more time.
talking that stupid Spanish around here when everybody else is English speaking American.
We are very optimistic. My interpretation is that that person is telling me that I'm not included in this. Can you please include me in your conversation? But unfortunately, most of the time it's not. It's just a way of saying that, get the fuck out of here.
What's the national language of the U.S.?
English. I mean, well...
I'm not exactly sure if it's English. There's a lot of people, different people from all over the world living in America.
There's no national language.
Oh, there is none. then we don't have to.
Speak English.
It's a waste of my time to say anything, honestly. Probably speak it better than you, so.
Speak English!
No, no quiero.
Speak English.
Learn another language.
Speak English. Speak English.
Fuck you. I don't care.
Why not learn another language? That will open up your mind to lots of other people that you wouldn't have a chance to know.
You know, there is value in multidisciplinarity when it comes to academic things, and there's a value to multiculturality when it comes to society. Like, it's just cool. You have more perspectives, you have more ways of problem solving or approaching things. There is a value to that, like inherent value. The more languages, the better.
All right. I want to just ask a question, a reflection, really quick. Sorry, fix my screen here. First of all, any initial reactions to this video, and if folks want to just even open up their mic or put it in their chat, any initial reactions to this video that folks might want to share? Anger for these people, embarrassment. Thanks, Allie. Let me see what else is in the chat. And the question, and unfortunately we don't have breakout rooms, but I do want you all to open up and share. Have you experienced or witnessed, maybe you haven't experienced it firsthand, but experienced or witnessed this type of discrimination and bigotry in your communities? And then where do you believe this stems from? Like, where does this type of hatred come from? I'd love to hear from folks if you want to open up your mic. What makes this training, you know, a great learning opportunity is when folks kind of share out some experiences. So love to hear from a couple folks.
I am always just so shocked and infuriated when people say, like, this is America, speak English, because much like Allie pointed out in the chat, like, we know the history of this land. This is not originally a place of earth where people were speaking English, and it just boggles the mind that folks want to throw that out as their argument or their, you know, this is the reason you should be speaking English. Well, no, I mean, like the woman said in the video, it's bullshit.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. Thank you. Anybody else?
I just have a personal story from my father. So my father's parents came from Mexico, and they moved to Milwaukee in the 40s, late 30s maybe. And so my dad, I mean, they spoke Aztec and Spanish in the house, but when my dad and his 8 brothers and sisters went to school, they were forced to speak English. They completely lost that aspect of them, because they would, you know, get notes sent home saying, like, you have to speak English in the house, and it was just absolutely devastating. So I learned some Spanish from school, but, you know, it would have been so wonderful to have kept that in the family. I think that's what Josh was saying too, like, he lost the native language. Like, it's just so sad that happened to our parents, and then it just didn't come down the generations at all. So yeah, unfortunately my father and a lot of that generation, especially in Milwaukee, well, in any part of the country maybe, but especially in Milwaukee, it's a really segregated area. They experience that all the time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Maria. I read a quote a couple months ago that said that the great American paradox is that even though this is a country where you have people from so many countries, so many nations, and so many languages, this is the country where languages go to die. That, and to me, I was like, oh my gosh, just hearing that of how, you know, America is kind of, well, for a lot of folks will say, oh, this is, you know, meeting the American dream, we're moving to America, and you know, wanting to make a better life. And yet this is traditionally where languages go to die. Like, people don't carry on their language past the second generation. Would love to hear maybe from 1 or 2 more folks
I'll share.
Thank you, Alexa.
Maria, like you, my grandfather came through Ellis Island, so I think that from Greece, and I think that immediately that was pick your name because you can't keep your Greek name. You know, Mattheopoulos isn't going to work for us, so you can pick Martin or you can pick Matthews. So he picked Matthews, but that was just the start of for him, you know, losing all of that when he came over from Greece. And it was the same as what Maria was saying. Then it was my dad barely spoke any Greek because that just, you know, they were called greasy Greeks and, you know, didn't want them speaking that language here, that you needed to speak English. And so my dad only knows a few words. And so when we go to visit relatives in Greece, it makes it really hard for all of us, even though everybody's so loving. But it's sad that, you know, we lost that piece.
Yeah. And think about like that disconnect that often happens with our family members, or even like, you know, connecting to our elders. You know, I think about my kids and my dad doesn't really speak English. And I'm like, you all have to, and I tell my kids, you all have to speak Spanish because you can't communicate with abuelo, right? Like this is how he needs to communicate with you. But think about how you start losing that and losing that connection with our elders and with family members. So thank you for sharing that, Alexa. Maybe one more person that might want to share any, you know, reactions to this video or even some of the prompts that I shared.
Yeah, along the same lines. So that I did type that in my poem of that the lost generation, because I think our parents or my parents they did get discriminated and they did experience those horrible names that we saw in the video. I haven't, because we were told never to speak Spanish because we're American, and my grandfather was born in Colorado and barely speaks English. And so you're right, like those, it's a definitely an issue. I tried to learn in school and was told if you can't speak it properly and perfect, don't speak it at all. So it's just been like a very traumatic trying to figure out where my language and culture is, you know, being kind of pushed to be more white and American and not what we were as Latinos. So yeah, very interesting discussion.
Oh my gosh, Josh, thank you so much for sharing that, especially in Colorado. I think, you know, there's a history, and we'll talk about the 4 eyes of oppression, about how, you know, students were not only shamed, but punished for speaking Spanish. And so parents, as a coping and protective mechanism, they didn't speak Spanish to their children, or they even gave their children English sounding names. You know, instead of being Maria, now they're Mary, and instead of being Teresa, now they're Teresa, right? And it's not Jose anymore, it's Joseph. And all of these things were, you know, oftentimes we think, oh, you know what, they wanted to become more American. No, it was a protective mechanism so that their children would not experience that same type of discrimination and racism. And you know, what I always find so fascinating about this is, you know, for folks of my generation that maybe struggled with that and don't speak Spanish, you know, I didn't have a choice because my dad didn't speak English. He only spoke Spanish in the home. So we had to speak Spanish. But I know, you know, there are other colleagues of mine that maybe do speak Spanish, but speak it, you know, not as fluently. You know, maybe they mix in some Spanglish here and there, and they lose out opportunities because now that people say, well, we want a bilingual, you know, for nonprofits, we want somebody that's bilingual. And so they end up hiring somebody that, you know, might be white and not necessarily, and maybe learn their Spanish in school and speak it very well, but we passed over maybe a Latino that was oppressed for using their language. And so, and I don't know if you all see the inequity there of how, you know, we celebrate one group, but yet we further oppress the other group because they lost their language. I don't know if that's making sense. But I see that happening all of the time, especially in the nonprofit sector. Yeah, any other thoughts before we move to the next thing?
I just want to say really quick, Josh, like I connected with you on, you know, you mentioned maybe you didn't speak Spanish in such a way that was very fluent or professional. And so I just want to say own it. Own it. Whichever way you speak it with an accent, there are people who think that accents are beautiful. And that makes you who you are, the way that you speak it. Because I know with language learning, there's this idea of having that certain accent, right? I was in Spain teaching English, and I'm a native Spanish speaker. But when I got to Spain and I heard others speak Spanish, all of a sudden it was like, this isn't my Spanish. This isn't what I know. My accent isn't like theirs, so they're going to judge me. And it did have a couple of instances that kind of like made me shrink. But over time, it made me realize, no, I'm gonna own it. This is my accent, and this is how I express myself. And if I make a mistake, then I learn from it and I try better next time. So I just wanted to say that. Own it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And folks, I'm going to actually be switching over to Spanish now. So make sure you are on the English channel. Make sure that you're listening in English. Okay, vamos a hablar un poquito
We're going
sobre...
to talk a little bit more about this idea of how language ends up being like some sort of a gatekeeper. And it's a term, a very common term that we use at work. And usually it's like a negative, it has a negative connotation. Like to talk about somebody or an organization, we say, oh, this organization is a gatekeeper, or they put barriers around their services. But we see that language ends up being a gatekeeper for so that many communities or people who are linguistically diverse, they can't have access to services. And I want you to think about this for a little bit. In your organization, in the services that you provide, language ends up being a barrier for people to have access to the services that you offer. You don't have to answer this out loud, but I want you to think about it. Is this a barrier? If someone wants to have access to the services that I offer in my organization, does this end up being a barrier for them? Yes or no? And we end up knowing or learning that language is more than a code. It's related to our social and political knowledge, and it helps us have access to power structures, to social capital. All of it has to do with language. It also gives us opportunities of employment, education. Think about those programs that we sometimes families, low-income families, they can't have access to because they get the information in English, or they can't fill out the application in English, or they have to go to like a meeting in English. And I remember when I was in high school, there were so many services on how to help your child have good ACT and SAT scores. What were the resources? And all of that was in English, right? It was never, ever in Spanish. So what happens is some students, maybe they don't have access, they don't have the same access to these opportunities that are offered to students who speak English. And what we notice sometimes is that immigrants and refugees end up paying what we call a linguistic penalty, or and sometimes this has been heard of a lot, been studying a lot, that sometimes or many times when you are a first generation, when you first get to the United States as an immigrant or refugee, what happens is that you don't want to call attention to yourself. You don't want to be categorized as someone who's different. And you say, no, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do anything I'm going to try as much as I can to listen, to hear myself, to see myself as a complete American. What does a complete American look like? That's what I'm going to try to look like. I heard a story that was so sad, and I was with a group of in Colorado Springs, and there was a participant whose mom is from Vietnam, and she is a U.S. citizen, but she has what do they call it? Like an autoimmune disorder, and she needs a special treatment, and she receives Medicaid services. What she does, what this woman does, the mom of this participant, is that sometimes she doesn't take her whole medication, or she doesn't take the medication every day, because then she'll think, I'm costing the government too much money. I don't want I don't want to be like, I don't want people to say that I'm receiving too many services. So she'll take her medicine every 2 to 3 days, so she doesn't have to go so often to go pick up medicine, because she doesn't want to call attention to herself, or she doesn't want to feel like she feels that she's paying for that penalty, that linguistic penalty as an immigrant. And that's what we see so many times with our communities, is that they feel that they have to get smaller so that they could fit into our system. I want to give you a minute to, in case you have a question or a comment or any reflections about this.
No?
No?
I'm going to actually switch over to English. What I do want to ask you is, how does it feel to listen in through interpretation? Are folks familiar with that? Have you all listened in before? What does that feel like?
I'm learning Spanish, so I listened to you in Spanish. I can't help with that.
Okay. I think some folks in the chat have something. Okay. It's new. Thank you for introducing. Love it. Okay, cool. Yeah, are folks familiar with it? Have you all ever been in meetings with interpretation before? No? Okay, this is exciting. This is cool.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
For Katie, since you're learning Spanish, is this one of the first times maybe that you have the opportunity to listen in to a presentation in Spanish?
Yeah, I'm actually very excited about it. And excuse me, when I came on and you were speaking Spanish, I was like, oh my gosh, yay, this is good. But the way that you're switching back and forth, and just the fact that interpretation is available both ways, I've never been in a meeting where it's been code switched so much like that. And I think it's really good. I'm a part of the bilingual committee at my agency. And, that is mostly made up of Latina men and women. And so just learning the way that they have to interact in a lot of these environments where they have to listen to interpretation, or they have to code switch with their families. And you're touching on this here. This is a really great experience for me.
Yeah, you guys will get to talk more about a little bit about this in the next session, but just how we're using interpretation right now as a tool to be able to communicate in more than one language. It's another thing is to be able to have presentations in another language and not always English, and have it interpreted. Pero qué bueno que estás aprendiendo español. Eso me da gusto.
I'm so glad that you're learning Spanish. That makes me happy. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Same for me.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I'm always so excited when folks see it and experience it for the first time, because I think it's kind of an eye-opener, and it gives us an idea of what it could be like, what our worlds could be like, right, when we have interpretation available. I'm going to continue on and talking more about language oppression. And I have a list of ways that we see how how language oppression is rooted in white supremacy. And this is not a comprehensive list, but I do want to share out some examples of how we see this play out. So the first is, and probably the most obvious one, is in immigration policy. One of the things that, always drives me crazy is, when you hear politicians speak about immigration, well, they don't say it as much anymore, but I remember as a kid, they'd say things like, we want people to assimilate and learn English and be good, upstanding American citizens, right? Like those are the things and it's always like coupled with learning English. Like we want people to learn English. But even, if folks want to become US citizens and they're under the age of 65, they have to take an English test to become a US citizen. And this wasn't always the case. It wasn't until after World War I, when there was an influx of German immigrants coming into the US, where the US was like, wait a minute, we're going to be overtaken by the Germans. We need to put some parameters around what it means to be an American. And that's when they started putting in this test of English, like an English proficiency. We also see within our immigration system, if somebody wants to, apply for a fiance visa or residency or anything, it's on the individual person to bring an interpreter. The immigration office never provides interpretation. In fact, there's a video, and it's a reenactment from a couple years ago of a little boy who's, sitting in deportation proceedings, and he's probably like 6 or 7 years old. And what that experience is for a lot of immigrant and refugees, where they're not listening in their language, and they're just listening in English, and they're saying, well, do you understand what we're saying? Well, obviously not, right? And so we see that our immigration system doesn't, even though we're bringing in folks from other countries, it doesn't allow for the celebration or the valuing of other languages. So that's one way we see it. One of the clearest ways that I see it is within our education system, and how we value, again, we value certain things and we consider other things deficits. And the best example I have of this is when my kids I have 2 children, they're 10 and 11 now, but I remember when they were around early childhood age, and I'm looking for a dual language program, a dual language school to put them in Denver. We're living in Denver at the time. And I remember putting them on a wait list and filling out the home language survey and saying, okay, what language do you speak in the home? And I say, well, mostly English in the home, although they speak only Spanish with my parents, their grandparents, and my parents were the ones that were caring for my kids most of the day at that time. And they said, well, you pick one, and I said, okay, well, I'll just pick English, because that was the dominant for them. So when my kids started school, my kids were labeled as dual language learners because they were English speakers learning Spanish. So my kids are labeled dual language learners. If I had answered that question as them being Spanish speakers, my kids would have been labeled as limited English proficient, LEP. Right? So I want you to look at the framing of each of these. One is an asset, right? If you're learning Spanish, it's an asset. You're a dual language learner. It's a good thing. But if you're a Spanish speaker learning English, you're limited English proficient. Do you all see the framing in that, and how one is an asset and one is a deficit, and how we place more value on those who are learning another language and they're English speakers versus those who are, speak a different language and learning English? So that is a way that we see how white supremacy sneaks into our education systems. We see this again in forced assimilation, and how we expect people who are Americans to sound, how we expect them to say things, and the accents that we expect them to have. I remember when I was a kid, my mom used to say, I want you to speak English in such a way that if somebody were to pick up the phone, they wouldn't be able to tell that you are that Spanish is your first language, right? There's a kind of a forced piece of saying, we don't want you to speak a certain way. We want you to sound more American. And we see this in our systems, in our nonprofits, and how we accept people in our spaces, or even how we hire folks. If they have a little bit of an accent, is that kind of a way or a barrier for us to hire people because maybe they speak a little bit differently? I've heard from many colleagues and friends from the African American or Black community that say, how much code switching happens, and how, they speak differently when they're in the workplace versus when they're, with their friends or at home. And that oftentimes they'll talk about putting on their white voice. What does their white voice sound like? And I know this happens a lot with, with communities of color, is that code switching that is always there of, how do I make myself small enough so that I can fit? Or how do I make myself more streamlined so that I can fit in the system? And of course, we see this with restricted access to services. And we talked a little bit about this previously, about organizations being barriers or being gatekeepers in terms of how folks are receiving services. So think about those food banks. Think about organizations that support around reproductive rights. What does it look like for a person who doesn't speak English to access those services? What does it look like when folks are experiencing domestic violence or experiencing homelessness? What does that look like when they're trying to access services? Is there a restriction? Is there a barrier? Is there a gatekeeper? Or are your services adaptive enough to support that? So I'm going to stop right here and either leave some time for questions or reflections, or if you see any of these ways shown up in your, like maybe you have an example that you might want to share on any of these. See something in the chat. All right, Kathy, I'm going to read it if that's okay. It says, I'm currently reading Flowers of the Killer Moon and didn't realize how Native American kids were forcibly handed over to boarding schools so the parents could keep their food, clothing, rations coming from the government almost after most of the buffalo were killed off. I knew about the boarding schools, but didn't realize how their children were being held hostage to keep the tribes alive. Very eye-opening and sad to say the least. Forced assimilation in a way I had never considered before. Oh, wow, Kathy. I'm going to have to jot down that book. See what it's called again. Flowers of the Killer Moon.
Yeah, there's a movie coming out in October. So my book club chose this read for September. I can't vouch for the movie, obviously, because it hasn't come out yet, but the book is nonfiction by a New York Times journalist. It's really good. It's sad, but it's good.
Yeah, I didn't realize that it was tied to the food and clothing rations. That's crazy.
Right. I didn't know that either.
Yeah. Oftentimes when we do the training for 40-hour for the community interpreters, we show a clip from, y'all familiar with the show 1923? It's a prequel to Yellowstone. I don't know if anybody's, well, there's a scene with a boarding school scene where a nun beats a native girl because she used her language. And and it's a very powerful and violent scene, but it really shows how gruesome, these institutions were about taking away or stripping that language away from folks, and that assimilation for sure. Anybody else want to share anything before we move to the next thing?
This is so reminiscent of, have y'all seen those videos or the memes that are like, tell me something that's considered classy if you're rich, trashy if you're poor. And it's like speaking multiple languages. Because it was the one that I saw came out right after there was some headline like, oh, the princess's daughter in Wales can speak 2 languages. How incredible. And it was like immigrants and refugee children speak 8, like, or just so many, at least 2. Why are you glorifying this?
Yes,
Because they're white.
I saw that tweet, and I say it sometimes too, Katie. It's so funny that you mentioned that. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Jen.
Yeah, I just think about my son was being evaluated for an IEP as he aged out of an early intervention program, and we had to meet with the school district and all those sorts of things. And we are a bilingual household. My husband is a Spanish speaker, and one of the risk factors that could qualify a child for extra supports in preschool and like government funded preschool is being someone who speaks another language than English as their primary language. So that was like a big evaluation point for us, was like, how much English does your son speak? How much Spanish does he speak? And like, is it enough of a risk factor for you to get these extra supports? So it's just, again, that it's just interesting to me that like, it's, limited English proficiency or things like that, that it's still something that happens, and it starts at the very youngest ages.
I had forgotten about risk factors, Jen, and I worked for a school district for some years, and I remember them, those checklists, if they're under the, such percentage of the poverty line, if they single parent households, but language, I didn't realize, now that I think about it, was one of those. And even more so, like when you think about how many children are misdiagnosed because of language, right? And they're labeled, or they have they are put on an IEP where really it's just they're just learning English, right? I've seen that a lot. I don't know.
Well, and he had like a language delay, and a lot of it was, much of it was because he was learning 2 or 3 languages at the same time. So of course he wasn't speaking immediately because he was learning 2 or 3 languages at home, as opposed to kids who only have 1. But yeah, I loved that was a risk factor.
Crazy. Yeah.
And I think also initially when you're learning a multiple languages as a child, you might be underperforming at school because of how your brain is having to process all this information in different languages. But there comes a point in time where you actually surpass the expectations that are set as the standard. So you might start off seeming like you're lower and underperforming, but really is because you're intaking so much information. And then it comes to a point where you just like, now you have 2, 3 languages. And that's actually, I want to say, a sign of intelligence versus just having 1 language.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks, Jen. That's such a great example. Anybody else before we kind of move on to the next thing that might want to share something? I'll leave space. All right. And you all have already talked some about the history and shared some examples. But just want to share out some case studies, and we'll spend some time doing this. We always see how, we celebrate the closeness to whiteness, or the closeness to, what we would consider a standard American English. That's what's celebrated. And if you break from that, if you speak with a little bit of an accent, you're always kind of seen as maybe not a good fit or not smart enough. And so that's why we always talk about that forced assimilation, of the pressure of immigrants and refugees, of saying you have to sound a certain way. And the onus to fit in is always on the non-dominant speaker. It's never on the system to accommodate for linguistically diverse communities. It's always on the linguistically diverse communities to try to fit in. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out, how do we shift that? How do we create spaces? How do we create organizations that can hold and celebrate and value multiple languages? I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 eyes of oppression. How many of you all are familiar with the 4 eyes of oppression? Anybody heard 4 eyes before? All right, so I'm going to walk us through it, because I remember when I understood 4 eyes of oppression, it really just transformed the way that I looked at systems of oppression and even thinking about how we dismantle systems of oppression as well. So the first eye is the ideology. And that is just like an idea that comes to mind, something like women are the weaker sex, right? That is the idea that might come to mind. Once that idea is there, then it becomes an institution. And so we see this idea with people saying, well, women are weaker than men. We see this supported by the church. Maybe you don't see, women clergy. Maybe it's also supported by government. Like, how many female presidents have we had in the US up to date? 0, right? Voting, who were one of the last groups to receive voting rights, were women, right? All supported by the ideology that women are the weaker sex, or maybe not as smart as men. So institutions then support the idea. What happens after the institution supports it is that then that impacts how we treat each other. Then you see rising cases of domestic violence, right? Men hurting women, or you see violence against women, the Me Too movement. These are the interpersonal things that happen every day, microaggressions even between men and women. So that's how it plays out interpersonally. I do want to mention that interpersonal is probably where we see it the most. When we think about oppression, we think about this the most. We think about interpersonal oppression. We think about things like that video that we saw, speak English, this is America, right? That's the thing that comes to mind when we think about oppression. But remember that it's supported by the ideology, it's supported by the institution. Then it impacts the way we treat each other. And lastly, and probably the most dangerous, is it becomes internalized. And that means that you start believing it and you start acting as if that ideology is true. So, women are the weaker sex. Maybe as a woman, I'll say, I'm not going to apply for that job because my job is really to be home with the kids. And, I might not be able to fulfill the duties of that job because of, my responsibilities at home. Right? Those are the sorts of things that we start to see. Or, we don't traditionally, women don't ask for raises as often or as much as men do. And so then you continue to see that wage gap because, we kind of have internalized this idea. But again, because it's supported by the way people treat us, it's supported by institutions and supported by the ideology. Is this making sense to folks? Yes? Let's look at this example with language. So let's say that the ideology for language is, immigrants who don't speak English aren't very smart and should stick to working minimum wage jobs. That's the ideology. So one of the ways that I saw this was during the 2016 presidential run, even before Donald Trump was the Republican nominee. What was his name? Ben Carson, during one of the debates, he said, of course we want immigrants here. There's plenty of work out in the fields for them. He said that during one of the one of the debates. And so the ideology is like, hey, yeah, we want immigrants. We want people that don't speak English, but we want them working in the fields, right? That's the ideology. So how does this translate to an institution? Well, maybe institutions will implement English-only policies, and then that's for better paying jobs. But if you want to, if you don't speak English, you kind of stay at working minimum wage. So that's kind of how it maybe turns out into an institution. You can see this in perhaps immigration system, our institution of you have to take the test to be a US citizen. That's how you see it translated. How do you see this interpersonally? Well, maybe somebody will say, hey, speak English, this is America. Or, the videos that we saw again of people mistreating, people that speak a different language because of the language. And then how do we see this internalized? Maybe a person that speaks with an accent is going to say, oh, I might not apply for that job, or I might not be smart enough because my English is probably not good enough. One of the things that I hear all of the time, when I'm out in community, is a person who is maybe has learned English as an adult. One of the first things that comes out of their mouth is, I'm sorry, my English is just not that good. And then they'll say whatever they want to say. And it's almost like they have to apologize. And we have to make space and say, no, absolutely. We appreciate you and we value you. If you speak English, we value you. If you speak Spanish, whatever language you want to speak, we value and celebrate. But have you all heard that before when you're speaking to a person that maybe learned English later in life, is they'll apologize before, and that's part of internalized oppression. I want the group to maybe walk us through maybe another example. This can be with ableism. Maybe this is with, our immigration system. Can anybody kind of give us an example of how you all see the four eyes of oppression play out? Does anybody want to give it a try?
I think it's disheartening on the PASA side of things. Sometimes you want to serve families to the best of your ability. And if I'm being totally honest, there have been a handful of families sometimes that are looking for a host home provider, but they say that their loved one doesn't do well with accents. And so how do you balance that line between trying to help someone with an intellectual disability, but the only three options you have in that area are providers from other countries where English is their second language? It's just really disheartening because I think it does a disservice sometimes to the person that's seeking services to begin with also. So.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So a little bit on like the institutional side, but also interpersonal, how we kind of treat each other maybe?
Yeah, interpersonal.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to maybe give us an example of how you might see that? And it doesn't have to be directly language.
Oh, I was going to comment when you were talking about the just comparing men and women in general, and when you were saying, like women might not apply for a job, or they might not ask for a raise. I'm not going to get the statistics right, but there is something where it's like and I see this in myself as well too, but if there's like a job and it has, you need all of these qualifications, there was something where it's like X% of women, like the majority of women won't apply for it if they don't have all of those qualifications, but the majority of men will apply for them if they don't have those qualifications. So it is kind of like, even for this job, actually at Alliance, I remember reaching out and I was like, I don't have 5 years of public policy at all. Like, but I was just so excited about this job, but I've never done that before. I would always be like, oh, I have all of these qualifications and that's fine. But if I didn't have one thing, like, this many years or like a master's or something, that I wouldn't even think about applying. So yeah, that's definitely been internalized in my head as a woman, at least, that, I have to be exactly here and, have all of the check marks, and otherwise I shouldn't do it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, such a great example of how all of these systems like impact you in turn, like you've internalized that message, right? Like of not being good enough because it's been supported by the institution, by the ideology, and by the way that you've been treated, maybe the way that you've been passed over for a job previously. Yeah, absolutely. I know we heard an example a couple months ago about how Home Depot has a policy. Well, there was somebody that used to work at Home Depot that they weren't allowed to use Spanish in the break room. Like they're not allowed to speak Spanish in the break room. And most of them, some of the workers were, Spanish speakers. But then, a lot of the contractors that come to Home Depot are Spanish speaking men. And so when they need, somebody to support them in terms of customer service, they call the Spanish speakers over to help these contractors purchase what they need. So they use it to their advantage, but then they oppress it on the other hand, right? And so just that cognitive dissonance to me, right? Like of how you could carry it as an asset if it's going to bring you some money, but then you don't want to be inconvenienced by the language. Any other thoughts before we kind of move to the next thing? All right. We are going to move us, we're almost to the end. We're going to move us into looking at some specific case studies. And I know you all have a PDF of the booklet, but I want to just to kind of start us on these case studies, I want to share a video with you. And this is from a documentary called No Más Bebés. And it's from late 60s, early 70s in LA. So I'm going to share it with you.
Acá tenían camas todavía. Mira. Y yo por dentro sí siento mucho tristeza.
Pues
recordar
lo que sientes.
¿cómo
¿Y
se
por qué
explica?
sientes tristeza volver?
Pues, ¿sabe?
Mira,
pero tengo
necesitas.
tristeza.
Sí.
This baby boy became a citizen 1 minute ago. His mother does not have immigration papers.
We're told they should be sterilized to save taxpayers' welfare.
Something drastic must be done about population growth.
The doctor walked in and said, "We cut your tubes." And I said, "Why?" He goes, "Well, you signed for it." I said, "Me?" I go, "I don't remember nothing." And I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell anybody.
They were extremely fearful, being told that you need an emergency cesarean section. You can feel blood pouring down your leg. At that time, signing the consent for tubal ligation.
This is the emergency department at Los Angeles County USC Medical Center.
Some of them signed right in the midst of labor. Some of them don't even remember signing. Here is this young lawyer, and for the first time, telling them, do you know that you've been sterilized?
We are suing HEW for non-compliance or non-enforcement of the sterilization regulations.
It was just the beginning of the emergence of the civil rights movement in the Latino community. We were talking about abortion rights, all of the issues of feminism at that time. The idea that somebody could be forcibly sterilized, seemed like something out of a mental institution out of the 1920s.
It's a claim that we're part of a greater goal of sterilizing the Mexican population that immigrates to Los Angeles. I mean, I'm offended by that. That's not what we did.
The way I felt when I was young, it doesn't change the way I feel in my heart now that I'm older. But it's there all the time. It's like when you bury somebody, you're always going to carry it on your head.
Sorry, I was on mute. How many of you all were familiar with the forced sterilizations in LA? And many of them were Spanish speakers, and it became a anyway, they won their case, but I want to so when the doctor said, hey, we weren't a part of that, they were a part of it. But you know, a lot of it was language and race related. But what I want to do right now is I want to give us an opportunity to individually, we're not going to do this in small groups. We're going to individually pick a group. And I'm going to share this with you all right now. We've got some case studies in a PowerPoint slide. But what we're going to do is you're going to pick a group that you would like to read more about. So it's not just Spanish speakers who have experienced language oppression. I'm going to share this with you all right now. We've got the African American and Black America community, American Indians, Native people, German speakers, Spanish speakers, the deaf community, and of course, some recent events around immigrant and refugees who have come to the US recently. So what I want you all to do is pick one group, and you'll have access to these slides, and you'll have access to the case studies. But I want you right now, I'm going to give you all about 10 minutes to review one group. And so if you want to put in the chat what group you're going to read through. And then what you're going to do, and I put the case studies in the chat. What you're going to do is read through your case study. Some of them have videos, so you can watch them individually. So if you pick African Americans and Black America, you're going to start on slide 2, and it goes through slide 6. If you picked American Indians and Native people, you're going to start on slide 7, and you're going to go through slide 13. So just pick one group. But again, you'll have access to all of these case studies later. But I do want at least one person to come back and share back about these groups, kind of what you learned. And in we're not doing breakout rooms, it's kind of individual. You're going to just kind of come back and share, like, if you were familiar with this, if you could see the way that the 4 eyes of oppression played into the case study, if you can see how the historical events or these case studies are impacting current systems, if this practice has been mitigated in any way, and then if it called you to action in any way. So the first thing that I'll have you do is just put in the chat which group you are deciding to read for the next 10 minutes or so. Right. And it could be like more than one person picks. I mean, we don't we don't have a lot of groups, but yeah, if you can just put in the chat which group you're going to read through. Thank you, folks. And it is 11:36 right now. We'll come back at 11:46. So I'm going to just play some, I actually won't play any music because I want you all to read through the case studies. And then we'll come back and debrief. And I want folks to kind of share out what they learned from their case studies. Does that sound good with everyone? So 10 minutes, we'll be back at 11:46. Does everyone have access to the slide deck? Yes, okay. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Oh, I'll put it again in the chat, Jen. All right. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Just a little bit of independent work for a little bit. All right, folks, we want to start coming back. All right. We're just going to do just a quick, we're not going to spend a ton of time, but just want to hear from folks any reflections that they had about the case studies. You don't have to necessarily answer the questions, but if you have any reflections, you can. Did anybody look through African Americans and the Black community? Did anybody read into that case study? If not, it's okay. We can, we'll kind of work on it next time. How about American Indians and Native people? I know a couple folks did that one. Anybody want to share out any reflections?
I'll share. I actually didn't know about the boarding schools until last year or a couple years ago when, they started gaining attention and momentum, and because of this act actually. And I've just been like totally horrified ever since. It's kind of like, in my generation, and I'm sure, so many before, there was just so much indoctrination. I think of the song, "This land is your land, this land is my land," and it makes me want to vomit. Like just growing up in a kindergarten where they were like, Thanksgiving was this, and everyone was cool, and there's no weirdness. And then you grow up and you start to learn the truth. And then even now, I'm, in my 30s, and I didn't know about this boarding schools until 2-ish years ago. And I'm like, it just keeps coming, and it's so gross and disgusting and horrifying. So just reading further into it, related to one of the questions, which of the 4 eyes of oppression could you see present? I can't even imagine the way that families and just individuals who are Native and of Native communities are internalizing all of this. And, you can't assume that they all knew either. Kids my age who live on reservations, even, like, what were they told? What were they shielded from? And so just the internalization that has to come from all of this coming out to folks who are a part of those communities and everything. It's just a lot. It's just a lot.
Katie, thank you so much. Yeah, like I remember Thanksgiving in school, and like the folks that were a little bit darker looking, I used to play the natives, right? And then all the white kids would play the pilgrims, right? And it was just like a thing that you didn't even think about. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, like that's just what it is. And then when you start peeling back all of the layers of the history, it's like, oh my gosh, and you're right, like I didn't know about it until I didn't read about it until college, right? There's so much I didn't know until then. Anybody else that read through the Native people or American Indians case studies that might want to share out any reflections? Right. What about the deaf community? I think a couple folks chose the deaf community.
Yeah, I did. I read a bit about it and took some notes. So there was one case study on a deaf driver who ended up basically just being beaten despite having a sign on his, I believe it's a man, a sign on their door that says deaf driver. And, people just didn't understand, the police officer that stopped them didn't really understand what to do. And because he was reaching into his pocket, he hurt him. And then eventually he ended up dying in the hospital later because of that. But that just brings you back. And I don't know what year this happened. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it was recently, unfortunately. But that brings you to actual laws and regulations and trainings that need to happen for, first responders and police officers on how to approach different situations, and, you know, even just paying attention to a sign. I mean, he had a sign on his door. That just absolutely blew my mind that that would happen. And then also there was some statistics on how the deaf community are more likely to have a co-occurring mental health disorder, as well as getting physically and sexually abused more than people without disabilities, which I think we're also very familiar with in our community of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, unfortunately, just because they are preyed upon so much. You know, people just don't really honestly don't pay sometimes close attention to them, or, you know, they're just kind of brushed aside a lot of the time. So people see that and their vulnerability and take advantage of it, unfortunately. So yeah, unfortunately we are familiar with that aspect of it, but yeah, I mean, laws always need to be improved and trainings need to be improved. People need to learn how to you know, talk to or not talk to, but just be able to communicate with this population that doesn't know how to communicate your way.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, the deaf community, for a long time, for the initial years at the CLC, we really focused language justice around talking around spoken languages, Spanish, Arabic. And it wasn't until like the last 2-3 years that we've really made an emphasis to talk about the deaf community and their experiences and how language justice relates to, ASL and the way that they experience access to resources or the lack of. So thank you so much for sharing. Real quick, if anybody wants to share about the immigrant and refugee cases, anything that caught your eye or any reflections? It's okay if we don't. We will have some time, we'll have some time at the next session. So next week, we'll actually do some breakout rooms. So Maria, we'll just make a note to click on that and I can share that with you so that we can go into some breakout rooms. But we'll have some time to kind of debrief the case studies. But the main point that I want to make sure that comes out of this first part of the training is establishing that language oppression is systemic and it's part of white supremacy, right? They're one and the same. I often say language oppression is the child of white supremacy, right? White supremacy birthed language oppression. It's the way that it manifests itself. And so when we talk next week around dismantling this system, we're going to talk about what are the tools at our disposal. And it's very easy for folks to say, oh, we just don't have the funding or it's too hard. Those are the conversations that always come up. And this is why we always start with what the problem is, because if we understand that it's a systemic issue, we're going to be focused on systemic solutions. We're going to be focused on what are the advocacy things that we need to do to make sure to organize and change. There are laws in place that we can change, but there are also internal policies and practices in our organizations that we can also change. So this is why we present this part of the problem first, so that next week we can really dig into what do the solutions look like. Is that making sense to folks? All right. I want to see if anybody has any questions or reflections before we close up our time together. And just so everyone knows, our next session is on the 19th at the same time. And everyone has access to the booklet and also the case studies. Well, so please read through, like during the week, just read through the case studies. Those are really good to just kind of know the history behind language oppression. Any questions or reflections before we close up?
Just thank you. so much. This has been great. I'm so happy to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Maria, anything we need to know before we close up?
No, I wanted to thank the three of you. And Elizabeth, unfortunately, we won't see you next week, but thank you for joining us this week.
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed the conversations that we had today. And, this first part of the training, as Rosa mentioned, really focused on the issue at hand, right? And it's like quite heavy right now, what we're leaving with. Some of these topics are depressing to think that it's happened for centuries, and maybe some things we're still seeing to this day. But the next session, we will focus, or Rosa and Indira will focus on tools that we can use to dismantle all of this. So there is hope yet. And this is a collective work. It doesn't matter if it's in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, if it's in education or in the medical field or in politics. There is work to be done in all of the areas. So I hope that in these conversations that we had today, we're just more aware of it. So then next time when you all gather, you can explore what some of those tools are to work at this.
All right, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Get some lunch, and we'll see you next week.
Bye. Thank you all.